Kia ora from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and good morning to you back in windy Wellington. Such a huge and happy welcome to this special ceremony today. We are all so pleased that you could join us. My name is Emily Wu and I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School, but much more importantly, I am a Kiwi to my core. On behalf of all of the Kiwis here at Harvard, I just wanted to say how immensely excited we were when we heard that you had won this award and how proud we are to be part of your team of 5 million. Thank you for everything that you've done to inspire people around the world, for the unwavering kindness and the humanity that you bring to public office, and for everything that you've done to keep our families safe this year. It can be really hard to be far away from home, especially as Christmas draws near, but knowing that our loved ones are happy and healthy makes that so much easier, so thank you. Congratulations again. I can't think of anybody more deserving, and I'm so glad we get to celebrate with you today. I'm now going to pass over to Sam, who's here to represent the Gleitzman Fellows.
Thank you so much, Emily. Congratulations, Prime Minister Ardern, on your Gleitzman Award. My name is Sam Vagar, he, him, his, and I'm a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School and a Gleitzman Fellow at Center for Public Leadership. Welcome to the Gleitzman family. My North Star is helping young people own their voices and power to make a difference. So it is a special honor for me to help celebrate you, Prime Minister Ardern. You have demonstrated leadership and the power of a new generation entering political life by centering kindness in leadership. You are inspiring me, young leaders here at HKS and around the world to believe in our ability to lead right now. Thank you so much. To help welcome you, I'm thrilled to introduce Dean Doug Elmendorf, Dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and the Don K. Price, Professor of Public Policy. Dean Elmendorf shares your belief in the power of this generation, and it is my honor to welcome him. Welcome, Dean Elmendorf.
Thank you, Emily and Sam, and welcome everyone. I'm grateful to the Kennedy School's Institute of Politics for helping to arrange today's event, and I'm grateful to all of you for joining us for this very special occasion. We are deeply honored today to be joined by the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern. In my remarks at the Kennedy School's virtual graduation ceremony last spring, I highlighted Prime Minister Ardern as a principled and effective public leader, a leader who took direct and early action to limit the impact of the pandemic, a leader who responded with compassion and integrity to a terrible terrorist attack, a leader who has served her people so well in so many respects. Today, we will be presenting Prime Minister Ardern with this year's Gleitzman Activist Award. The award was launched more than a quarter century ago by Alan Gleitzman and Sherry Roche to recognize those who have inspired others and shaped our world for the better. We will always be grateful to Alan and Sherry for bringing this award to the Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. And we are fortunate to have Alan Gleitzman's partner, Sherry Roche, with us today, as well as Alan's daughter, Judy Kaplan. We are delighted also to be joined today by the advisory board for our Taubman Center for State and Local Government at the Kennedy School. Past winners of the Gleitzman Award include Tarana Burke, Malala Yousafzai, Nelson Mandela, Gloria Steinem, and John Lewis. Alan and Sherry's generous gift also allows us to bring students to the school as Gleitzman Leadership Fellows, like Sam, and to have a professorship named in Alan's honor that is currently held by Professor Julie Battilano. The Gleitzman Award comes with $150,000 in prize money, which Prime Minister Ardern has generously directed to a scholarship for a student from New Zealand enrolled at Harvard Kennedy School. The Gleitzman Award will be presented by the director of our Center for Public Leadership, Wendy Sherman. Wendy came to her role as a professor of the practice of public leadership at the Kennedy School after serving as U.S. Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and leading the team of Americans who negotiated the nuclear deal with Iran. Earlier in her career, Wendy was a social worker who assisted battered women and troubled families, She was the state of Maryland's first director of child welfare and the chief of staff to Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski and later campaign manager for Mikulski's first successful Senate campaign. Please join me in welcoming Wendy Sherman.
Thank you so much, Doug. Good evening, everyone. And I don't know about you, but I'm so excited I can hardly stand it. And so thrilled to have the Prime Minister with us tonight, this morning at her time virtually. And good morning to everybody in New Zealand and around the world, because we have people all around the world with us this evening. In fact, more people have registered for this virtual ceremony than have ever registered for a forum event before. And if you add in our live streaming, we literally have thousands of people who have come. And they have come because we're all in a time of tremendous challenge and difficulty. And the joy of being inspired by a leader who represents the values of social activism and community and purpose and leadership and the importance of public service is more than anyone could ask for. It's such a joy at such a very difficult time. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge and welcome and thank a few people who are with us. Harvard President Larry Bacow is with us this evening, and he will make some closing remarks. You've just heard from Kennedy School's Dean, Doug Elmendorf. We also have Iris Bonet, our academic dean, and Janie Wilson, our executive dean. We have Institute of Politics Director Mark Guerin, who partners with us on the Gleitzman Award, and so much more every year. We have former Gleitzman Award winners, the faculty committee, members from the Leadership Council of the Center for Public Leadership, many people who spent months thoughtfully considering this year's winner, and our faculty committee really came through looking at all the public nominations that we got. Our student Gleitzman Fellows, young social activists and leaders in their own right. And I think the theme of this evening, because Prime Minister, you are very young, not much older than most of our students, is that leadership does not have to wait until you have hair that's the color of mine. You can begin quite early in life. I also want to acknowledge our New Zealand friends. The Right Honourable Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand from 1999 to 2008, who has been a friend, a colleague, and a counselor of mine. I think of the Prime Ministers as well, who was very helpful in making all of the connections here. Her Excellency Rosemary Banks, New Zealand's ambassador to the United States, the first woman to hold that position. We like first women. New Zealand students, faculty, and community members. And last but certainly not least, Prime Minister Ardern. We are virtual, but as I said, the energy leading up to today has just been phenomenal. We have sent to the Prime Minister a video from students who really wanted to say how grateful and excited they were, but we didn't have time to show the video tonight. Prime Minister, your commitment to inclusive politics and policies, the health of your people, the health of our planet, and during this most unprecedented year is a model of strength and humility. You have described yourself as a pragmatic idealist, and we see that not only in the policies of your administration, but the way in which you work with your peers and your people. We'll talk more about this in conversation between the two of us and then with our students. But first, before you speak, I want to thank you for spending this hour with us. And as this year's Gleitzman International Activist Award winner, thank you for dedicating this year's prize money to a deserving HKS student from New Zealand. As the director for the Center for Public Leadership, I work with a team to help prepare the next generation of principled, effective, and just public leaders. I couldn't be happier that our ambitious and committed students like Sam and Emily have the opportunity to hear and learn from you tonight and be in conversation with you tonight. So now, over to you, Prime Minister.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. And kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Doug. And welcome to my office. I'm humbled to be amongst such esteemed guests here today. First of all, can I say thank you for the opportunity. When I was first approached about this award, I did express some hesitancy. For anyone that knows New Zealand, you'll know that by nature, we're reluctant to place much stock on individual actions, let alone accept individual acknowledgements. It's a trait that is deeply ingrained in us as a people, and that I know Emily will well understand. But before saying no, I asked the question of the school, would you consider turning the award into a scholarship for a New Zealand citizen? And when the answer came back yes, I knew my answer had to be yes as well. So here we are. I've been asked to speak on the topic of leadership, a wide-ranging topic. I will do so briefly though, lest I cut into the time that we have to be in conversation, which I always enjoy more than being on a pulpit, virtual or otherwise. But rather than share with you a range of theories on leadership, I thought instead I'd rather share a story or two. I grew up in a small town in New Zealand. There were roughly 5,000 people in my town, 600 students in my school. I was roughly about 17 before I even had the opportunity to meet a politician in the flesh. It's fair to say I never really aspired to be a member of parliament, although there were plenty of jokes in my school that I'd become one. In my school yearbook, in fact, in 1998, I was awarded most likely to be Prime Minister. I can assure you that was for no other reason than the fact that I was literally the only one in my school who was either remotely interested in politics. If you'd asked me in 1998 what I would do with my life, I would have had probably three answers. Possibly I would become a policeman like my father was for 40 years. Probably I would have a family quite young because I was raised Mormon. Probably I would have considered myself to still be a volunteer for the Labour Party and politics because that is at my heart what I loved. But despite that belief, some 10 years later, in 2008, I entered into Parliament. In 2017, I became Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, and within that same year, I became Leader and then Prime Minister. You know, in a country where we've had two previous female Prime Ministers, my journey is not especially remarkable, nor the speed of it. In fact, I remember seeing the quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg once, "What is the difference between a bookkeeper in the garment district and a Supreme Court judge? One generation." We are like that here. My mother was a bookkeeper. My sister and I were the first in our families to attend university. In this most recent parliament, we've now elected the most diverse parliament that New Zealand has ever had. And just this week in our parliament, an Eritrean refugee who started life in New Zealand just 15 years ago as a cleaner entered into our House of Representatives. What is probably more noteworthy then is that even in this environment, we still have young people, especially young women, who don't necessarily see themselves in the leadership traits of our politicians. And that's something I want to change. Let me give you an example. I'm often asked to speak to students, often in high school. It's a role and a job that I really love, so I take up the opportunity as often as I can. And a few years ago, I was asked to speak to a group of young people at an all-girls school about their hopes and their dreams. It was a fairly ill-defined topic, so I decided to focus on my own personal experience as a student who at their age never saw myself becoming a politician. I asked them two questions. Firstly, if they could do anything at all with their lives, what would it be? I watched them all scribble down an answer. I then gave them a second follow-up question. What do you think you will be? Without hesitation, I watched all of those young women pick up their pens and write down a second different answer. Now, I'm not sure what I was expecting. Perhaps I'd hoped they'd all look at me with confusion and perhaps clarify if they just were meant to write the same answer twice. They didn't, because what they hoped and dreamed of was very different to what they believed they would do, even at the tender age of 16 and 17. Now, I could have stood there and been outraged at the limitations our young people were placing on themselves at such a young age, or I could reflect on why it was that it didn't surprise me, because it didn't. And that's because we believe in what we see. If we do not see ourselves in the role models and leaders in front of us, how can we possibly imagine that we could do that too? Yes, that means seeing diversity of ethnicity and gender identification and age in careers and leadership roles, but it's about much more than that too. It's about seeing diversity in leadership style as well. When I ask young people, for instance, to undertake another exercise for me, the starkness of this comes through so clearly, and I'm sure we'll see it with you too. If I ask you to close your eyes and imagine a politician, and I'm asking you to do this virtually, I understand I can't check in on any of you and whether or not you're doing it. But if you close your eyes and imagine a politician, what do you see? What age are they? What gender? How are they standing? How do they sound when they talk? Are they assertive and confident? What are they saying? Now, Zoom's going to make it a little difficult for me to get live feedback on that exercise, but I can share with you what the most common response I receive when people I ask to do that in person tell me. More often than not, people tell me that they imagine a man, that they're older, and that they have grey hair. Now, no one should feel bad about that. Statistically, that assumption is correct. But putting aside the physical, there is something quite telling about the rest of the description. They tell me they see and hear someone who is assertive, someone who is confident, someone who's very reassured, almost brash, someone they perceive as having ego. And that's when I can't help but ask myself, if those are the character traits of what we have come to expect in politics or indeed in leadership, does that create bias? An assumption that these are the traits you must possess to survive and succeed in often these very harsh environments. And if that is what we have come to expect, is it any wonder that our young people have in the past shied away from believing that this is a place that they want to be, or indeed that they can be? I wonder this because I believed it myself. As a kid, I thought politics was a place that could create change, a place where you could do good, but I didn't believe it was a place that I could survive. Even when I got here, I questioned that. But at some point in every profession and workplace, in every leadership environment, we have to stop and question whether these traits, whether these characteristics that we've long assumed are required for the job actually are. You do not have to have personal ambition to be a leader. You do not have to be the loudest person in the room. You can believe in consensus more than you believe in conflict. You can be human. You can feel and show emotion. You can be kind, empathetic, and strong. You can, and indeed you must be, your own kind of leader. And until we do that in so many fields, we will still have young people who, when they close their eyes, don't see themselves. And I hope that in some small way, at the bottom of the world, we have been changing that over many years. And I feel deeply privileged to have played even the smallest of roles in that too. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, and thank you very, very much again.
Well, we could stop right there and everybody would feel like they have gotten something very special today. But I'm going to ask you a couple of questions and then turn to our students in the time we have. So, Prime Minister, you've just talked about leadership and what the traits of a leader are. I think our students heard your story, but still are probably wondering, so how did that 17-year-old become a leader? Why did your peers call you a leader in your yearbook? And how did you learn those skills? People have spoken of your skills, and I'll come to some of that and some of the issues in a moment, but how did you come to be who you are?
I was a girly swat, so that's my honest answer. I learnt many of the traits that I value now in the same way that many do. My parents, first and foremost, the excellent teachers I had in my public schooling. And I think the difference is that I continue to place value on those traits that we teach our children. You know, when I think about the things that I want to instill in my baby girl Neve, I want her to be kind. I want her to be thoughtful. I want her to be generous. I want her to have the ability to place herself in the shoes of others and be genuinely empathetic. Now, why is it that we value so much the imparting those traits in our children when we teach them while they're young, but we still differentiate the leaders that we see, be it in the private sector or indeed in politics? We attribute a very different set of character traits, and suddenly those things we teach children in their youth, we then equate to weakness. So you asked the question, how did I learn those traits? I learned them as everyone does. How did I hang on to them is probably the question. In part, I would say it's because I didn't necessarily have my own personal ambition to be in this position. So I therefore never made a judgment call that in order to survive or succeed, I needed to trade them away. In fact, I made the decision that I was going to be myself, and if that meant I was successful, then so be it. But if it meant I wasn't, so be it. And along the way, some by chance, I found myself in positions of leadership by saying yes to opportunities. I haven't always been the best at self-promotion. Very few New Zealanders are very good at that, but by saying yes, but also never being willing to compromise those qualities, that is how I found myself in this position.
Well, I think, Prime Minister, everyone knew of you, but over the last several months, people have come to know you more. The way that you spoke to your countrymen and women after the terror attack in your country, the way you have handled the pandemic, which is surging in our country in really horrifying ways. So what do you think we, the United States, which sometimes needs a big dose of humility, what can we learn from your experience and the way you have managed and led in these circumstances and others, but particularly these two, because they have been very, very difficult?
And, you know, the first thing I would say is that, you know, we feel deeply privileged to be in the position we are as a nation, and we also acknowledge freely that we are in a position that is not easily obtained by every nation. We have a very large moat, which our border has served us very well. It's enabled us to make decisions that don't necessarily come easy for others. Right? If I were just to reflect on our own experience, you know, there were things that we learned very, very early on about COVID-19 and the impact it would have on our population that guided our decisions. And right at the centre of our decision-making, and I put this down to a New Zealand value, not necessarily an ideological one, was the importance of our people. You know, we often say in New Zealand, what is the most important thing? It is he tangata, he tangata, he tangata, the people. So I remember sitting down very early on with my chief science advisor, who I during COVID spoke to multiple times a day. And when most countries were talking about smashing the curve, you'd talk about flattening down the curve, that principle was the idea of make sure the outbreak isn't so great that our health systems couldn't cope. And we sat down with the modelling, and the curve, even when flattened for New Zealand, very clearly was still going to lead to people losing their lives. Flattening the curve wasn't sufficient for us. And because we put people first, and because our view was that the best chance of our economy thriving was our people thriving, we immediately pivoted our strategy. We said we need to move to elimination. We have to adapt. So I think humbling ourselves to the knowledge that others had, using it, taking a science-based approach that put people first, and sticking to our strongly held view that that would be the best way to support the economy, I think has served us well.
So, Prime Minister, you just formed your new government for your second administration. Congratulations on your re-election and the forming of your government. You've been incredibly inclusive and diverse, and you spoke in your comments about how we all come in different packages, in different styles, and bring different things to the table. And I actually have watched that unbelievably moving statement by your first African-born MP. My eyes filled with tears at his authentic self, so different than anybody else you might have imagined. And you've just ensured Maori representation in your cabinet. So what steps do you think you have taken, your society has taken, to get to this point of inclusion? Maybe not as far as even you want to be. What do you think leaders can do to ensure the kind of diversity and inclusion that we all strive for?
I think probably the first thing I'd say is New Zealand openly acknowledges we are not perfect. And we, for instance, are about over the next few weeks to receive the Royal Commission into the events that led up to the devastating terrorist attack in Christchurch on the 15th of March in 2019. That led to a huge loss of life for our Muslim community here in New Zealand. So we know that we have a lot of work to do on issues of racism in our nation. But I think in amongst that, we also, within the political environment, we have a system in New Zealand, the mixed member proportional system, which allows ourselves, and in fact, I think places a responsibility on political parties to use a political system that gives us the opportunity to ensure we have representation. We have a mixture of directly elected individuals, but also a process that allows us as parties to have a list that we construct of those supplementary members who are able to come into our parliament. That system, I have no doubt, has allowed us to make sure that New Zealand and its parliament reflects who we are as a nation. And so often when people speak to the diversity of parliament, I will say our parliament is New Zealand, and it is getting closer to looking like who we are as a nation. And therefore, in doing so, it will get closer to making decisions that are to the benefit of who we are as a nation. So how do we impart that how do we as leaders make sure that we are delivering on that? We see it as a responsibility. We will be better governments when we govern on behalf of everyone, when we have that diversity of voice, and it is our responsibility to ensure that we deliver it. Just so happens we have a system that helps us greatly in that.
So I want to let students know in about, I'll ask the Prime Minister a couple more questions and then I'll turn to the students. So you should get in the queue and just remember the Kennedy School mantra, which is that stand up, introduce yourself, but then ask a question. That means it ends with a question mark, not an essay, but make sure that we can get in a bunch of questions for the Prime Minister. So Prime Minister, it's hard for me not to talk about gender, as you did in your own remarks. I'm not a prime minister, but I've certainly dealt with glass ceilings along the way, to say the least. We've yet to elect our first woman president. We just have elected our first woman vice president, and she is also a woman of color, both African-American and of Indian descent. So my question to you is, what's your secret? You've had 3 women prime ministers, Jenny Shipley, Helen Clark, and now yourself into your second term. Many women, as you said, doubt their ability. You and I talked briefly about imposter syndrome, where we always think maybe we'll be caught out as a fraud, when in fact we're not. You are incredibly young. Have you ever doubted yourself? What else can you impart to here in America to move this agenda forward?
Ambassador, probably the better question would be, has there ever been a day when you haven't doubted yourself? And that's, you paint a picture of New Zealand well. I grew up with female prime ministers. And that has meant that there was never a point in my life that I can recall where I ever thought, I can't do that because I'm a woman. And so I pay absolute tribute to people like Helen Clark and Jenny Shipley for carving that path for me. However, I have on many occasions thought I cannot do that because it's me. Imposter syndrome is real. I speak openly about it because in part, the day that I stood and sat in a lecture theatre and heard Helen Clark, she'd come to the end of her career and she was in politics, I should say, certainly not in generally. And she was talking about the pivotal moment where she had decided she was no longer going to stay in the New Zealand Parliament and she was considering what her next role would be. And someone from within the foreign affairs community contacted her and said, Helen, there's a role within the United Nations Development Program. Perhaps you get hearing Helen say this. She said, oh, I haven't got much experience in aid and development. And the response from the person on the phone was, Helen, you have run a country. And to me, the fact that someone who I considered to be so experienced, so wise, who could do anything, still in that immediate moment about considering the next opportunity, took a deficit approach and pointed out what she couldn't do, told me that everyone must feel like that at some point. But I think it is more acutely felt by women. And so my message to young people is don't wait for the moment where you suddenly feel that you are ready, because sometimes that moment won't come. We need to accept the opportunities, take them on, and be bold and confident enough in ourselves to just say yes in spite of that feeling of fear and doubt. And the more often we have our leaders talking about that, I think more often people like me who sat in that audience listening to Helen will think, maybe not all of our leaders have that full brimming of confidence that I expect. And if I have self-doubt, maybe that's okay too.
So just one or two questions sort of in the international realm, and then we'll go to the students. China looms very large for the United States and for the Biden administration as it comes in. And the president-elect has talked about how we have to build back better here at home to stand on the world stage, about how we have to be able to compete with China and challenge them where we need to as well. As much as China is an issue for us, you're in the neighborhood in a really profound way. So how does New Zealand think about China?
You're right. In our region, we are deeply embedded within the Pacific, and with all of the responsibility that we believe that brings, both in terms of strategic relationships, but also obviously our largest threats in this region, which I would name as climate change. China's role and presence here, of course, incredibly important, both as for their strategic presence, but also the relationship they have with many nations in terms of aid and development and indeed trade. I think what I would say, and this is what came through strongly for me in that initial conversation that I had with the president-elect, is clearly the view that he takes is that leadership matters, that the role of the United States in foreign policy needs to be one of engagement and presence, and that is something that we would welcome. Our relationship with China is a complex one, but I think it's also a mature one. What we've had to learn over time is how do we balance the ongoing need to speak to the things that matter to us, human rights, for instance, when there are scenarios and situations that sit counter to our principles, speak to those openly as part of our dialogue, but continue to maintain the strength of our economic relationships as well. And in a mature relationship, we have to be able to do that. But we equally, seek for other nations to engage in that way as well. And so I look forward to greater engagement in our region by the United States, greater presence, and greater dialogue in a way that seeks to build consensus in our region.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to the students, and I'm sure they'll ask some of the questions I would have still loved to have asked about economics and about climate and about the changes in the world. But we're going to start with Maynard from the college, and Maynard, if you'll unmute yourself and put your video on and ask your question briefly so we can get in lots of questions. Maynard.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sherman. Hi, Prime Minister Ardern. My name is Manat Banassi. I'm a junior at Harvard College. Thanks so much for your awesome words on leadership. I would just love to know my questions about what inspires you and what motivates you. Thank you so much.
Manat, thank you. I'll try and keep this very brief. I think, for me, it's actually real simplicity. The reason I spoke to the COVID response for us being driven by people is because ultimately that's what's brought me to politics. I was never motivated by the idea of personal position. When I joined the Labour Party, I thought that I would probably continue on as a volunteer, delivering leaflets over the course of my life. And probably that is how I will finish in politics. And so my presence in politics has always been because I've seen it as a powerful tool for change for the betterment of people. I believe in equality. I believe in making sure that people have all of the opportunities that their potential should offer. I believe in children not living in poverty when you live in a prosperous nation. And I've always believed politics can change those things. So that's why I delivered leaflets. It's why I said yes to the opportunity to come into Parliament. And it's why I am the Child Poverty Reduction Minister as well. That is my inspiration, is continuing to improve people's lives through politics, particularly our children. Yeah.
Thank you. Next up is Corey from the Harvard Kennedy School. Corey, if you'll unmute yourself, go ahead.
Kia ora, Prime Minister. It's really great to meet you.
Kia ora.
My name is Corey Tahera, and I am a 2019 HKS Master in Public Policy alum, hailing from West Auckland, New Zealand, currently living in Washington, DC. So if you make it over to DC to meet President-elect Biden anytime, hit me up. I'd love to say hello in person. Okay. My question to you is this. In recent years, New Zealand has been judged to have some of the lowest levels of corruption and some of the highest levels of public confidence in the political process in the world. Despite this, my fear is that the emergence of a professional political class and sophisticated lobbying industry, in addition to our arguably out-of-date campaign finance laws, is a perfect combination of factors that could begin to see our democracy fall victim to big money interests who wield increasing political power. In light of this, what reforms to domestic campaign finance and lobbying laws will your government push for in its current term? And how much of a priority are these reforms for you, given everything else you have on your plate right now? Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Corey. Thank you for the question. I think probably what I'm about to tell an American audience will astound them in terms of our relative campaign finance laws in contrast to the United States. So many people may not know, Corey obviously does, that we have spending limits in our electorate seats in our constituencies when we individually campaign to be MPs of $25,000. And so that is designed to make it accessible. That means that, that you can be a school teacher and run a political campaign and not be outdone by someone who has more access to greater resource. And so that's something that is very, very important to us. But as Corey rightly points out, we have, of course, the ability to receive donations as political parties. We have to declare those. We have to make them public. We've just recently banned, basically, foreign donations. But I do think there's more to do, because you're right, Corey, it's about preserving our position as being free of corruption and constantly being willing to analyse whether or not our finance laws are achieving those goals and keeping public confidence. So already, I've just recently was looking at some papers from our team to start a process across all of our Parliament to look at what we might need to change around our electoral finance legislation to maintain that confidence in our system. So I want that to be a cross-party piece of work. We should all support it, be committed to it, make sure that we're retaining public confidence. And in this term of office, I do want our campaign finance laws to be a focus of our attention for reform, because I think it's needed.
Great, thank you so much. Next is Tracy, who is a board member of the Taubman Center. Tracy.
Good evening, Prime Minister. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Tracy Zen, and I'm president for Zipcar and also a board member at the Taubman Center. My question for you is, you introduced the world's first well-being budget last year, focusing on mental illness, child poverty, and family violence. New Zealand is the first Western country to design its entire budget around well-being priorities and instruct its ministries to design policies for the well-being of its citizens. Can you please share with us what drove this initiative and what outcomes, if the outcomes are tracking to your expectations? Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. Excellent question. And the reason we did that was quite simple, and it's actually the same reason that and I'm going to perhaps not quote it exactly correctly, but the statement that was first coined in the United States, that GDP measures everything except that which matters most. And that was the reason we did this. As with many Western democracies, the tools with which the public, the media, institutions tend to judge the success or otherwise of a nation are so heavily focused on economic measures. And as many of you on the call know and appreciate, GDP is such a crude tool. You could be demonstrating significant growth as an economy, but at the same time have devastating levels of youth suicide, homelessness, and environmental degradation. And in fact, when we came to office, that was exactly what New Zealand was experiencing. We'd been described as a rock star economy, particularly as we came through the aftermath of the GFC. But all of those other well-being markers were frankly markers of shame for us as a nation. So we wanted to shift the discourse towards how do we measure and therefore prioritise within our usual budgetary processes through our machinery of government a wellbeing lens. And that's why we have within our Treasury a living standards framework. So that means that we analyse our spending decisions in a different way. And it's also why we have a requirement that as part of our budget, we must report on child poverty progress and how many children have been lifted out of poverty and will be by our budget initiatives, because we're trying to shift the measure of success away from those traditional tools that do not tell the full story. To be honest, Tracy, until though the discourse changes, until we value other measures, not just as politicians, but as society, it's not necessarily something we'll sustain beyond a political cycle. So I'm thinking now more of how do we widen the dialogue around what matters to us and what's important to us.
Really important answer, Prime Minister. Next up is Izzy Ernst, who is a Master of Public Policy student from Germany and one of my course assistants, and we've done a lot of work together. Izzy.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Prime Minister. My name is Izzy Ernst. I am a Master of Public Administration student at HKS.
Sorry, Izzy.
You talked very inspiringly about our sometimes screwed expectations of politicians earlier. My question is about the public debate on female leadership this year, given that many female heads of government like yourself have been doing so exceptionally well in the COVID crisis. How do you think about your leadership style and all the expectations that come with being a woman in such a high-powered position? Do you ever consciously play into the gender stereotypes imposed on you, or do you more often do the opposite and stay away from them or purposefully even reject them?
Oh, this is a good question. Do you know, I'll share with you a little story that'll perhaps give you a little insight to the internal conflict I faced on this question. I think many of us, I think rebel too much at the idea of having to be defined by our gender and having our leadership defined by our gender. And early on, I think I was very much in that frame, even when I was a new member of Parliament. I remember in opposition, and at that stage, I think if I recall correctly, I was a front bench leader, so I was reasonably senior within our party in opposition. There was a cartoon published one day by one of our regional newspapers, and it depicted me as as one of the girls that holds up the scorecards during a boxing match. I was in a bikini with stilettos, and it had a speech bubble over the current leader of the opposition, my current leader at the time, that said the public need me to find an appropriate job for Jacinda. So it was, you know, pretty demeaning and pretty awful. Another journalist called me to ask for my reaction, and I remember at the time really deliberating what I should do, what I should say, and I decided that I didn't want to make a thing of it. I didn't want it to be particularly pronounced. I was worried about being portrayed as humorless or too sensitive. And so the only comment I gave was something terribly lame, like, I'm sure the good people of Southland deserve better cartoons than that, or something like that, just to make it go away. I remember down the track wondering about that approach that I took, because I consistently took that approach. If anything came up and anyone blamed anything as being sexist or me being having something sexist happen to me, I would shy away from the commentary. I would try not to get caught up in it. I would try and make it go away. And I started to question why I was taking that approach. And it was because I was worried that I would be stereotyped, that I would, as I say, be seen as humorless or sensitive. But then I started to wonder what other young women would think. What would they think if they saw some of that treatment, and think that if they went into politics that they would experience that too, and that maybe I did need to speak up. So it's been a journey for me where I haven't wanted to be defined in that way. I think I said once, I want to be a good leader, not a good female leader. And I'm often thinking in this space, you know, being defined by being a mother, being defined by, you know, having a small child in politics. Often you think that that's how you or your entire leadership will be defined. But I also take very seriously the responsibility that I cannot just ignore those things when they happen. Other women are watching, young girls are watching. So I do have a duty of care, but I haven't always felt that way.
Thank you for your authentic, very authentic answer, Prime Minister. Let's try to get in one or two more before we have President Bacow bring us to closure here. Sarah Lynn, who is a Gleitzman Fellow. Sarah?
Hi, Prime Minister. Thank you so much for being here today, and congratulations on this well-deserved award. My name is Sarah Lynn, and I'm a current Master's in Public Policy student at the Kennedy School and a Gleitzman Fellow. And I have a question tonight on behalf of the current Gleitzman Fellows. So given our fellowship's focus on creating social change, we wanted to know how you conceptualize the change-making process from within government, and what specific levers you found to be most powerful when driving social change, even in times of crisis and fear. And also, of your achievements in the social change space, is there one that you are most proud of, or one that was particularly unexpected? Thank you.
I'll try and share an answer, if I may, Sarah, and thank you for your question, with an example. You know, I think often in politics, we succumb to this idea that we need to reflect what simply the public may expect of us, or redesign ourselves to fulfill expectations. And in the course of doing that and trying to build a narrative about who we are as politicians, very often we start to doubt, question, or ignore our own instincts. And for me, one of the most important levers in being able to lead important social change is your proximity to the public. You know, how much you're able to sense how they're feeling and where they are, and your willingness to listen to your own instincts. And in such a crowded environment now, where we're increasingly in different leadership roles, we'll be inundated with data, qualitative and quantitative, focus groups, people telling us what other people think, and therefore what we're meant to think. It's very easy to lose, I think, that connection to our instincts. And yet I think that's it's imperative that we hang on to that for the purposes of social change, because often that will be our connection point to other people's reaction to that change. So if I can give you an example, often in crisis, we have no crowded environment. You're not overwhelmed with data. You just have to respond. And if we keep that proximity to our public, to the people we serve, we'll be able to more quickly get a sense of what they're expecting, what they're feeling, and when they need that reassurance or that guidance to get through those tough times. When COVID-19 hit us all, we were all having to move very, very quickly in order to ensure that we weren't devastated by large-scale outbreaks. Often 48 hours made all the difference. And we found ourselves in a position where the data was coming through to us to demonstrate that we were possibly on the brink of a very significant community outbreak early on in March. We knew that we were going to have to take significant steps to move our country into a fairly aggressive form of lockdown. Now, when thinking about how we would take New Zealand to that place, I reflected as much on what I was seeing on my walks from the Beehive to Premier House every day, seeing people loading large bags of flour into the car, hearing conversations on the street. I could sense the fear that people had. And so that meant that instinctively I felt that we needed to lift our communications, make it very direct, share everything that we knew about the virus, create a plan so that people knew if we saw X, we would need to do Y, so we could just take people with us. But a lot of that was just based on our proximity to what we were seeing in our own families and our own communities, or what I was seeing on my walk home from work. So never losing your instincts and keeping your proximity, for me, is how we just get a sense of what the population need in order to create change, particularly in a crisis environment. So those to me are very important traits, and one we're blessed in New Zealand, given our small size, to be able to hang on to as leaders.
So we had another Kiwi about to come up, Sam, but I'm going to have to set you aside this evening. The Prime Minister has to stop quite soon. And today is a day when she is putting out a climate declaration about the urgency of that crisis, which is true, I think, for all of us on this planet, and really a tribute to the Prime Minister's leadership. So I'm going to turn it over to President Bacow to summarize where we are and to close out this fantastic conversation and this event this evening. Over to you, President Bacow.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Sherman. Prime Minister, thank you so much for your moving remarks and your thoughtful answers to questions from members of our community. In less than an hour's time, I think we've all seen why you're among the world's foremost public servants, widely admired and deeply respected by people literally from around the globe. When I listened to you speak, I couldn't help but think of one of the previous recipients of this award. As Dean Elmendorf mentioned at the beginning of this event, United States Congressman John Lewis received the Gleitzman Award in 2017. And Congressman Lewis was also his own kind of leader, a beloved civil rights icon who demonstrated the power of kindness and empathy and humility, but also strength, values which you spoke to so eloquently in your own remarks. He was a human being whose words and deeds, I think, continue to inspire many of us today. And I want to quote some of those words. He said, freedom is continuous action we must all take, and each generation must do its part to create an even far more just society. The work of love, peace, and justice, he continued, will always be necessary until their realism and their imperative takes hold of our imagination, crowds out any dream of hatred or revenge, and fills up our existence with their power. Thank you, Prime Minister Ardern, for demonstrating the power of continuous action in pursuit of freedom. I think your leadership stands out at this moment in time, at a year that's that's demanded from each of us sort of personal sacrifice so that we may protect and preserve the health, the lives of family, friends, loved ones, and neighbors around the world. Your leadership also stands out in a year that has tested the capacity of our imaginations to conjure futures in which, yes, love and peace and justice for people and for the planet are in fact possible. And I think your leadership stands out in a year that has challenged and perplexed and frankly exhausted so many of us. This comes as no surprise for those of us who have cheered you on from half a world away since you took office 3 years ago. Time and again, you've acted with compassion, you've acted with conviction in service to the people of New Zealand. I think you've inspired citizens around the globe to expect more from their leaders and from their governments. And I think you've also given hope to people of a better future. And as I think you know so well, one cannot lead unless you can persuade people that the future is going to be better than the past. And you've done that so well and so eloquently. We're grateful for your leadership and for your activism. We're honored to have you share your time with us, your wisdom with us today, and to do so virtually. But I have to say, I look forward to the day when we can, in fact, invite you back to our campus, not virtually, but in person. I think I speak for everybody who's been privileged to be part of this remarkable session today when I say that day will not come too soon. Best of luck to you for continued success, not just for the people of New Zealand, but for everybody who cares about good government and democratic values throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much. I've been so humbled by today and I look forward to seeing you, I hope, in person one day soon. Please take care of yourselves, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We're going to let the Prime Minister go back to work, and thank you very much for joining us here this evening, everyone. Thank you, President Bacow, Dean Elmendorf, everyone with us. Thank you, Prime Minister.
Kia ora.